Hello, ladies and gentlemen. 2024 has truly been an amazing year as it saw the rise of a new world champion, even contesting people like Magnus Carlsen. This new world chess champion is Gukesh Domoraju. Today we'll be seeing a game played in 2024 that led the path to Gukesh Domoraju being world champion. So we start this amazing game off with e4, then c5, the Sicilian defense. Then Gukesh develops his knight. Then Wei Yi develops his pawn to d6. Then Gukesh plays knight out to c3. Then Wei Yi responds to that by taking his knight out to e4, bringing it to a more active position. Then Gukesh plays knight to e2, developing his knight to a more active position, potentially then moving it to a more active position on c4. But right now, Gukesh is playing a more of a defensive position than an attackive position. So then here Wei Yi plays pawn to e5, pressuring the square on d4 with his two pawns on c5 and e5 respectively. Then Gukesh responds to that by moving his bishop to a more active square. But he doesn't really protect that square. But it's alright because Wei Yi can't really put that much of an offensive. And here all the Wei Yi and Gukesh both try to gain control of the middle. Wei Yi develops his knight to e7, but his knight is already kind of trapped. But he moves it there since Gukesh can move his pawn on b3 up 1. Then he can move his bishop on c1 to g5. Pinning his knight to the queen, which here Wei Yi just would have blocked that with the knight to e7. I think that's what he was thinking, something along those lines. So then here Gukesh plays pawn up 1, which is a developing move. All the players are trying to gain control of the middle. Then Wei Yi plays here knight to c6, putting a more like militarized place on d4. I don't know what you call it. I just use that term since I'm like into geography. So now Gukesh plays bishop to g5, like what I was saying earlier. And then what Wei Yi does here is he castles, putting his king in a more like protected position. So, what Gukesh plays here is taking the knight on f6, and by doing this, there's nothing to protect the square on d5, which then will become a trouble for Wei Yi later on. Then Gukesh here plays then Wei Yi takes back, then Gukesh occupies that square with his knight, also attacking the bishop on f6. What Wei Yi responds to that is with bishop to e6, attacking the knight, and then what Gukesh plays is queen up 1, maybe attacking the king a little in future positions. And then what Wei Yi plays here is pawn to a6, later trying to invoke the bishop to move back since he can move the pawn on b up 2 to b5, attacking the bishop, making the pawn move back one. So then what Gukesh plays here, my bad guys, 1 second. So what Gukesh plays here is just castling, bringing his king also to a more protected position. So what Wei Yi plays here is pawn to b5, attacking the bishop. So then here Gukesh just retreats his bishop to b3. Then Wei Yi here moves his king to h8. I think he might have thought of some kind of offensive that Gukesh might have made on the f7 pawn, but he definitely thought of some like answer that made him go to h8. So then what Gukesh plays here is pawn up one, maybe probably because he wants to protect the square on b4, but also a retreating position in case for the bishop on b2, just in case like later on if the pawn on c5 can go to c4. So then what Wei Yi plays here is rook to b8 to maybe trying to push his pawn up one later on in the game. And the queen here is actually occupying a lot of squares, and it's actually like it's like looking across the board like a bishop. Like it's like being really useful. So then what Gukesh responds to that is by moving his pawn up one to h3, trying to prevent the bishop to g4. And then what Wei Yi plays here is he plays pawn up 1-2. But that's actually kind of like a bad move, since if Gukesh takes the bishop, if Gukesh takes the bishop, if Gukesh takes the bishop and then the queen takes, and then the bishop on b3 then takes the bishop on e6, then the queen takes on e6, then he can get some counter offense. Gukesh can then move his queen to h6, which could threaten checkmate, because then he could later move his horse to g5, which then the queen could maybe, but probably not, take the pawn on h7, being checkmate. But I know that Wei Yi would probably have defended that, but yeah. Those are probably that he probably weakened his position probably a little. And then what Gukesh plays here, is pawn up one, trying to prevent the pawn on b5 for going to b4. And then what Wei Yi plays here is bishop back, which is actually a really good move, since it secures these two squares and it protects the king from any like offensive that they might trying to take. So what Gukesh responds to that is by moving his bishop to a more secure position, all away from the pawns that could potentially trying to like strike an offensive. So what Wei Yi does here is moving his pawn to f5, and if he moves it one up to f4, then that valuable diagonal of the queen can be cut off, which is actually really bad for Gukesh. So then what Gukesh plays here, he doesn't let that happen. He puts his knight on g5, which threatens a fork and threatens to take the undefended bishop on e6. It threatens the fork by like the fork which forks the queen, rook, and the bishop, which can be really deadly if that would happen. So what Wei Yi does here is just retreating his bishop to the king um by moving it back two spaces. So what Gukesh does here is taking the pawn on f5, which is a good move since now he opened up the position. And now what Wei Yi does here is taking back on uh, f5. And then Gukesh here plays pawn to f4, trying to prevent um, the pawn cutting off the diagonal. And if Wei Yi takes the pawn, then the queen can go to a more active position, and it's actually a pretty good move, thought out move for Gukesh. What Wei Yi plays here responsibly is moving his pawn up here, which here if what I wouldn't have done that because if Gukesh takes, then Wei Yi takes, then Gukesh can just take with the bishop. I think he did like some calculation here, some like miscalculation, but I don't know. Maybe it's like a strategic plan for the rook on b8 to get like a free file on the pawn on b2. So then they trade the pieces. Then indeed Wei Yi does get a free file, almost a free file, except for that b2 pawn, which then he later puts more pressure on. So what Wei Yi does here is taking the pawn on f4, and what I would have done here is taking with the queen. Instead, Gukesh takes with the horse. I mean, no, he doesn't take at all, but like he um, prevents it from going forward. So what Wei Yi does here is moving his knight to uh, a5, trying to support his rook maybe later on by going to b3 or some of that sort. So what Gukesh plays here is retreating his bishop again to a2, and then Wei Yi plays knight to b3, delivering a deadly fork with the rook on a1 and the queen on d2, which Gukesh easily stops by just taking the knight, and now the rook comes into the game. And what Gukesh plays here is taking the pawn with the horse instead of the queen, which I would have taken with the queen. But he's a grandmaster, and I'm not, so I think he probably did that under some condition. And he also has like the potential to deliver a deadly fork on e6. So what Wei Yi responds to that by moving his queen to b6, delivering a check across the board to the king on g1. So what Gukesh does here is he blocks with the rook. And now both of the pieces of Wei Yi are staring at the pawn on b2. So what Gukesh plays here, what Wei Yi plays here is putting extra pressure on that pawn by moving his rook to b8, and what Gukesh plays here is moving his rook. My bad. By moving his rook to d1. So what the sequence is just like trading pieces, and Gukesh ends up with an extra pawn, No, they trade pawns. So here Wei Yi takes a pawn. Then they equally trade pieces. Then Gukesh takes back that pawn by moving to d6. So in order for the pawn on a6 not to get captured, Wei Yi moves it up one. And what Gukesh plays here is moving his rook to d8, pinning the bishop to the king, and maybe trying to get an offensive with the knight by moving the knight to e6, potentially attacking the bishop on uh, g7, weakening his position potentially. So what Wei Yi plays here is he takes the pawn on c3. Then what Gukesh responds to that is by attacking that bishop by moving it to d5. And remember that the rook is still pinning the bishop to the king, so the bishop can't take the knight. So what uh Wei Yi does here is by checking the king. And what I think Wei Yi could have gotten checkmate here is because he could have moved his knight to e5, and if Gukesh wasn't careful and he moved his knight, and then Wei Yi could have moved his bishop to g3, blocking those two squares off, and then maybe if Gukesh wasn't careful, it would have been checkmate. But that probably wouldn't have happened because Gukesh probably would have saw that. So what Gukesh plays here is by moving his knight to f2, and Wei Yi does a brilliant move by the best move in this position is by moving his rook to d1, and this is because he attacks the knight on d5, and also um, and also if Gukesh moves his rook anywhere else, he if he moves it anywhere else, then the bishop can overpower that knight and take it, and um and Wei Yi is pinning the knight to the rook, so he can't move the knight. So Gukesh finds a sneaky move by taking the bishop on g8 with the rook, which is check. So black has to take back, and then Gukesh takes the free bishop on c3, which is actually better for him. So what Wei Yi does here is attacking the knight, and then they just maneuver their pieces around for a little, and Wei Yi tries to get his knight into the game. They keep just maneuvering their pieces. They attack each other, moving, and then Wei Yi's king slowly inches into the game, and then they just maneuver their pieces. Wei Yi trying to get repetition, but Gukesh declining. Then giving many checks, and then Wei Yi retreats his king back. Then Gukesh, Wei Yi pins his knight to the king, and then Gukesh simply just moves his king. So then what Wei Yi does here is just trying to get repetition, and then they still just maneuver their pieces. And then what Wei Yi does here is attacking the pawn on h3, and what Gukesh does here is checking his king, who moves back. Then Gukesh just simply just moves his pawn up one. And remember that pawns next to each other are stronger than pawns that are separated. So this is actually a little bit of an advantage for Gukesh. So what Wei Yi plays in this position is the best move in this position is rook to h3, which is really useful because it attacks both of the pawns. So what Gukesh plays here is defending that with the knight to e2. Wei Yi then plays pawn up one putting more pressure on that pawn. And what way Gukesh does here is attacking the rook on h3, and then Wei Yi attacks the um knight on g1, and then Gukesh simply just takes the free pawn on f4. Well, it's not really free because Wei Yi just takes back another pawn, the free pawn on h4. So then they just keep maneuvering their pieces a little, Gukesh pushing his pawn forward, and then Wei Yi also trying to push his pawn forward. And then here what Gukesh does is trying to secure the spots in front of the pawn on f6 and f7, so they're gonna be safe. So he might later put his knight to f5 later to secure those two positions. So what? Oh, but here he moves it to e5 instead, but it serves the same purpose. So then Wei Yi just retreats his king back to the back rank again. He literally moved his king all the way up here and moved it all the way back there. That was like such a waste of moves, but it's alright. But so what Gukesh does here is just charging his pawn up, and then Wei Yi also charges his pawn up. Then Gukesh charges his pawn up since those squares are like free. And what Gukesh does here and is what Wei Yi does here, and he like attacks the pawn on f7 because it's about to promote. So what Gukesh does here is the only move that he can win the game with, and is to g5, because then he can later move his knight to h7 to secure that final square, and he can also take the pawn on h3. So what Wei Yi does here is just charging the pawn. Gukesh moves his knight back to f3 to block Wei Yi's access to that pawn on f7, and then Wei Yi, instead of promoting, he moves his king to e7, which then what Gukesh does is taking the pawn on h2, which is a free pawn. Then what Gukesh does here, what Wei Yi does here is attacking the pawn on a4, the white's a4 pawn, potentially trying to charge the pawn on a5 forward. So what Gukesh does here is moving his knight back, trying to secure that final square. So what I think he's gonna do here is that he's gonna move the knight on g4 to h6, and then that protects the pawn, and then he's gonna move the knight on e5 to g6 to secure that final square. So Wei Yi just delivers some checks and takes the pawn, and then Gukesh plays the brilliant move to h6, and then Wei Yi responds to that with another check. Then Gukesh just simply just runs his king up the board. Then Wei Yi resigns the game, since it's pretty obvious that Gukesh is gonna win here. And that's it, guys.